Hi, my name is Colin Lightbody, and I'm the president and founder of HR and Labor Guru, Inc. On behalf of the company, I'd like to welcome you to our on-demand webinar series. Before we get into the presentation materials, I'd like to take a few minutes to let you know a bit about our company and also give you some insight into my professional background. First, let's talk about the company. HR and Labor Guru's goals are to provide practical, value-added, human resource and labor solutions to our clients through on-demand webinars, plus training and consulting engagements. Our company specializes in a number of areas, including the following. First is bargaining preparation and strategy formulation for labor negotiations, development of negotiations costing models and bargaining tools, identification of opportunities to reduce and/or mitigate rising labor costs, healthcare cost reduction strategies, addressing high unplanned absenteeism, including FMLA in the United States, and finally, HR analytics in terms of building effective analytics teams and identifying and executing high-value projects. Next, let's talk about my professional background. I established HR and Labor Guru in 2019 after retiring from Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, or FCA, with 20 years of service. My last position held at Fiat Chrysler was Director of Labor Economics, People Analytics and Insights, and Hourly Attendance at Chrysler World Headquarters in Auburn Hills, Michigan. In terms of labor negotiations, I have over 20 years of union negotiations experience, and I've been actively involved in numerous multi-billion-dollar deals. While at Fiat Chrysler, I was actively involved in virtually every set of national negotiations in the United States with the United Auto Workers Union since 2003, every set in Canada with Unifor, formerly known as the Canadian Auto Workers Union, since 1999, and every set in Mexico with the CTM Union since 2004. My roles and responsibilities ranged from being a bargaining subcommittee chairperson to benefits accounting, labor economics, and labor strategy expert, to negotiating with presidents of the national labor unions. In 2007, I participated in the negotiation of the transfer of Chrysler's multi-billion-dollar retiree health care obligation to a United Auto Workers Union-sponsored healthcare trust. In addition, over the years, I was actively involved in facilitating several special agreements, including corporate restructuring deals pertaining to shift eliminations, plant divestitures, and plant closures. In my opinion, though, my biggest claim to fame is the fact that for many years, I provided strategic bargaining guidance and worked directly with the late FCA Chief Executive Officer, Sergio Marchionne, arguably one of the best negotiators of all time. Also, I was a member of the Mercer Labor Employee Relations Network in the United States for over 10 years. Therefore, I had the distinct pleasure of networking, benchmarking, and sharing best practices with some of the world's top labor executives from multiple industries on topics ranging from absenteeism challenges to labor negotiation strategies. In terms of HR analytics, as head of the People Analytics and Insights team at Fiat Chrysler, I directed numerous special studies, including the following: internal labor market maps and employee turnover studies for the salaried workforce, and deep dive studies on topics such as absenteeism and hourly hiring process for the hourly workforce. In addition, I was an active member of Mercer's HR Analytics Network, known as the Internal Labor Market Network, for over 3 years in the United States. As a member of this group, I had the opportunity of networking with some of the world's top HR analytics professionals and consultants. We regularly shared stories about growing pains, the challenges, the success stories, and the lessons learned from our unique HR analytics journeys. From an educational perspective, I'm a professional accountant, both a CPA and CA, and I was employed at Deloitte & Touche for 10 years prior to joining Fiat Chrysler. I also hold a Bachelor of Commerce degree with a concentration in accounting and finance from the University of Windsor in Windsor, Ontario, and also hold a Master of Business Administration degree with a concentration in human resources and labor relations from Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. Why should you attend this seminar? For one, the union negotiations process can be a very daunting task, even for the most seasoned labor relations executives. Therefore, as you'll see, it's never too early to begin the bargaining preparation process. Accordingly, this module outlines the key negotiations preparation activities that should be performed anywhere from 12 to 18 months in advance of bargaining right through to opening day. The key areas of focus for bargaining should include a number of things, including the bargaining environment assessment, development of a robust internal governance process, development negotiations, costing models, formulation of bargaining strategy, and finally, creation of a comprehensive communication strategy. The key learning objectives for this module are as follows. You'll gain an understanding of the 6 basic stages of the collective bargaining process. In addition, you'll learn how to conduct a bargaining environment assessment that will assist the organization in anticipating union demands, developing management proposals, and formulating an overall bargaining strategy. In addition, you'll set up a robust internal governance process that clearly establishes the composition, roles, and responsibilities of the various bargaining subcommittees, support teams, and oversight committees. Also, you'll ensure that all relevant stakeholders have a say in the process and are kept apprised of progress. And also, it'll ensure that appropriate lines of communication and approval processes are in place. In addition, we'll get a high-level overview of a 3-step approach that can be utilized to develop a dynamic negotiations costing model. As well, you'll have an awareness of bargaining tools that can be utilized to formulate overall bargaining strategy. And in addition, you'll get an understanding of a strike analysis and preparation of a strike manual. And finally, you'll learn how to develop a comprehensive communication strategy that addresses numerous key aspects, including messaging content, format, cadence, and delivery models. Also, attendees will gain an appreciation for the importance of managing union expectations, being prepared for all possible bargaining outcomes, as well as the potential impact of social media. Who will benefit from this webinar? I think that directors and vice presidents from a number of different areas will benefit, whether it's HR, labor relations, finance, even communications, I think would benefit from this. Any labor relations professionals involved in the bargaining process would benefit, and also controllers. As an introduction to this module, I'd like to reiterate that union negotiations process can be a daunting task, even for the most seasoned labor relations leaders, and it's never too early to begin the bargaining preparation process. This webinar is really designed to provide a high-level overview of the bargaining preparation process, and we have deeper dives on select topics, and they're presented in other modules due to the volume and complexity associated with those certain concepts and topics. On this module, we're going to look at the 6 stages of the bargaining process, and we're going to focus on bargaining preparation stages 1 to 3 that are noted on the slide after this. And again, we're going to focus on the following key topics: the bargaining environment assessment, the internal governance process, negotiations, costing models, and corresponding strategy formulation, and then finally communication strategy. This chart shows the 6 basic stages of the collective bargaining process. The first stage is really long-term bargaining preparation, which typically happens 12 to 18 months prior to the start of bargaining. I mean, one can argue that this is ongoing, and it's just an illustrative example, but that's typically when you start really getting into the grind of long-term bargaining preparation. Midterm bargaining preparation typically occurs 6 to 12 months prior to the start of bargaining, and then short-term bargaining preparation occurs less than 6 months prior to the start of bargaining. And we'll see as we go through the module that there are a number of different processes and issues that we want to address in each one of those stages. The bargaining period is usually up to 2 months typically. In the automotive industry, the bargaining kicked off in mid-July with an agreement target date of mid-September. So that's about a 2-month period. Some are longer, some are shorter. If you get a tentative agreement, then there's, assuming without a strike or lockout, the contract expires, and there's a ratification period if there's a tentative agreement reached. And usually it's up to 10 days typically for ratification. Again, it depends on the number of locations and the complexity of trying to organize the ratification meetings and so on. And then after ratification, once it's ratified, there's the whole implementation period, which takes place after ratification. So now we're going to move on to the first major area of focus, the bargaining environment assessment. And I'll talk about a quick overview here first. This assessment is really an important step in the bargaining preparation process, as there are so many factors to consider when developing an overall bargaining strategy. By preparing a comprehensive assessment of the bargaining environment, it'll really assist the company in a number of ways. It'll help you to anticipate union demands. It'll be helpful in developing management proposals to address any operational concerns the company may have. And an economic environment assessment will certainly help in formulating potential economic offers It can also help in subcommittee member selection by seeing who the union bargaining team is and maybe matching up the appropriate people on the management side. And also it'll help you to develop a communication strategy in order to manage union member expectations before bargaining begins. We're now going to turn our attention to the various stages of the bargaining preparation process. So as you recall earlier, stage 1 was the long-term bargaining preparation time frame, which is typically 12 to 18 months prior to bargaining. So the bargaining team should review the results of previous negotiations, and they should review their notes, minutes, results of previous negotiations, just to familiarize themselves with the union's positions or arguments and rationale on specific topics. In negotiations, past behavior is often a good predictor of future behavior. Are there any patterns? For example, does the union initially ask for general wage increases in every year of the contract, but then later settle for a general wage increase in year 1 with lump sum payments in subsequent years of the contract? You should ask yourself, does the union have any deep-rooted philosophical beliefs on certain topics? Historically, has the National Union been philosophically opposed to certain contract elements, or does the union have any long-standing guiding principles on topics such as profit sharing or two-tier compensation structures? In the case of the Canadian Auto Workers Union, now Unifor, the union basically has publicly denounced most forms of variable compensation such as profit sharing. In fact, the union was created in the mid-1980s when the Canadian contingent of the United Auto Workers Union disagreed in principle with the UAW leadership on a number of issues, one of the key ones being profit sharing. In addition, Unifor has openly criticized the concept of two-tier wage structures where traditional employees enjoy higher wages and benefits than new hires. On the other hand, Unifor has demonstrated a willingness to increase wage progression periods for new hires, where new hires ultimately move to the same maximum wage rate as a traditional employee, but over an extended period of time. While the extended wage progression model does not typically offer the same level of savings as a two-tier wage structure, it does offer real savings. The takeaway here is that you have to pick your battles. It's sometimes easier to take the savings that are available, such as in the case of the extended wage progression, and then look for other opportunities to generate savings rather than fight the union on deeply rooted philosophical grounds such as the two-tier wage structure. This is just an example from the auto industry. Another question to ask is, are there any significant unmet union demands that were in place from prior sets of negotiations? If so, there's a very good chance that those will show up again. Take a look at what the anticipated union bargaining team looks like and ask yourself a number of questions here. Company reps should review and assess the personalities of the union bargaining team from prior bargaining sessions and anticipate any changes to the union bargaining team for the upcoming negotiations. And you should consider the following aspects. If there are changes to the union bargaining team, what impact, if any, will there be on the bargaining process? Also, if there are new union bargaining team members that are unknown to you, consider reaching out to other companies who deal with these individuals to obtain some insight on their bargaining styles and personalities that may help you give some insight into what these folks are all about. Does it make sense to match certain management bargaining team members with certain union bargaining team members? It may or may not. Are there any perceived internal conflicts in the union bargaining team? If so, will this be detrimental to the bargaining process, or can this perhaps be leveraged to the company's advantage? Another question to ask is the local union supported by the national union? All these questions may set the stage for your approach in this situation. The bargaining team should conduct a thorough review and analysis of the grievances and arbitrations over the life of the current contract. Not only will this assist the bargaining team in identifying potential union demands, it will also highlight legitimate concerns and issues relative to existing contract language that should be addressed in bargaining. In addition, the team should identify operational issues that may have created friction between the union management over the course of the agreement that are not covered by the contract and or are exempt from the grievance procedure and arbitration process. Just as an example, the contract may not provide pay for employees if they're sent home early due to a part shortage caused by a supplier. If there's been significant unpaid time as a result of these part shortages during the life of the contract, the employer should fully expect the union demand for short workweek pay in circumstances when employees are sent home early due to supplier issues. It's also a great idea to talk to operating management before you do your bargaining. Management team members who supervise the union employees are in an excellent position to provide valuable input into the bargaining process. These supervisors can offer insight into the following: operational concerns in the contract from an employee perspective, things such as health and safety concern, payroll issues, job classification issues, etc., efficiency opportunities from a company perspective, They're in a position to identify contractual provisions that hinder efficiency, for example, excessive job postings, lines of demarcation issues, etc. And also, they can assess the level of employee support for the union on specific topics. For example, in many cases, the union is demanding significant wage increases while the employees are telling their supervisors that they just want to keep their job. Recent industry settlements are an excellent source of strategic information. They can offer tremendous insight into what companies and unions in the same or similar industry are willing to do to reach an agreement. I think this concept can be best illustrated through a couple of examples. In the mid-2000s, the Detroit three automakers, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, were faced with skyrocketing labor costs. So one of the largest drivers of labor cost inflation was legacy costs, in particular retiree health care. In this case, the automakers had significantly higher numbers of retirees than active employees, so it was becoming a huge burden on them. All three automakers had downsized significantly to the point where the efforts of every active worker had to also support the legacy costs of up to 8 retirees, I believe, in one case. This was a recipe for disaster, and this business model was not sustainable unless the automakers could do something to rein in legacy costs. Goodyear, different industry, had recently negotiated an innovative agreement with the United Steelworkers that allowed the company to transfer its retiree health care obligation to an independent union-sponsored trust, Voluntary Employee Benefit Association, VEBA Trust. This agreement allowed Goodyear to de-risk its balance sheet by transferring the risk of future retiree health care inflation to the union trust, and certainly helped the Goodyear labor costs. Accordingly, the Detroit three automakers researched and benchmarked the Goodyear Steelworkers Agreement and began negotiating a partial transfer of their respective health care obligations to a UAW VEBA trust in 2005, with a full transfer of their respective obligations during national bargaining in 2007. So this really illustrates the value of researching recent settlements in similar industries. It doesn't even have to be the same industry, despite the fact that they're with different unions even. Another example of researching leveraging recent industry settlements occurred in 2011 during Detroit 3 automaker preparation for national bargaining. Again, another company, Caterpillar, had recently reached an agreement with UAW, and the contract settlement highlights suggest the UAW was willing to entertain the following: elimination of the cost of living allowance formula, payment of lump sums in lieu of general wage increases, and variable compensation in the form of quality awards. So it wasn't surprising to see the Detroit 3 automaker contracts negotiated with the UAW in 2011 carried similar provisions to those negotiated months earlier in the Caterpillar UAW agreement. So I guess in summary, the study of recent industry settlements allows you as a bargainer to anticipate union demands, identify union industry trends, and most importantly, provides potential innovative solutions to company concerns, things that have been tried and tested in the past. Where possible, it's also an excellent idea to conduct competitive benchmarking. Wages and benefits are probably one of the most important things to take a look at from an economics perspective. Wages can probably be pulled from Bureau of Labor Statistics reports or publicly available information on competitors and other companies in the same type of sector. Operational metrics as well. There are certain things, like for example in the automotive industry, there is a report called the Harbor Report that does productivity measurements, and also J.D. Power that looks at quality. So if your industry has reports similar to this, take advantage of them. Another valuable tool is to do a high-level assessment of the bargaining environment today versus the bargaining environment during the last set of negotiations. Consider a number of factors, such as the overall economic factors, such as inflation, unemployment rates, etc. Also industry-specific factors, such as industry sales, are they higher, lower, and company-specific factors. Is the company more profitable, less profitable than last time? Are there changes in demographics that may affect the ratification? This next chart is an illustration of what a bargaining environment assessment for the Detroit 3 automakers would have looked like in 2015 national negotiations with the UAW. Clearly, as outlined in the chart, the illustrated bargaining environment assessment for the Detroit 3 automakers pointed to a more challenging bargaining environment in 2015 versus 2011. The U.S. automotive industry had experienced a significant increase in retail sales volumes, and on average, the Detroit 3 automakers were enjoying increased profitability. Accordingly, one would expect that the UAW would be demanding significant economic improvements, especially in light of the fact that UAW members had not received a wage increase in nearly a decade. The UAW had the right to strike any of the 3 automakers in 2015, providing increased leverage to the union versus 2011. Finally, the proportion of new hires or Tier 2 employees at each company had increased significantly by 2015 as well. Therefore, the UAW's demand for new hires to reach traditional employee wage rates had to be taken seriously, or they knew there would be a significant risk to achieving a ratified collective agreement. So, in summary, this bargaining environment assessment tool provides excellent insight into the challenges facing companies, allowing the bargaining teams to begin strategizing early on for anticipated union demands. Moving on to stage 2, which is the midterm bargaining preparation timeframe, which is typically 6 to 12 months prior to bargaining. Really, in this stage, you're looking at, are there any changes to the bargaining environment that would require updating to the bargaining strategy? So it's just looking at it holistically. Are there things that need to be updated? Competitive benchmarking should be updated as required. And also at this point in time, you should consider whether or not it makes sense to ask a third party to make a formal presentation to the Union Bargaining Committee during the negotiations process. And if the answer is yes, then start making arrangements for that. And then finally, for stage 3, the short-term bargaining preparation phase, which is typically less than 6 months prior to bargaining. Again, update the bargaining environment assessment and strategy as deemed necessary, and update your competitive analysis and lock in competitive data to be used in developing presentations to the union at this time. The next major area of focus is in the internal governance process. As mentioned before, the coordination of a set of union negotiations can be a daunting task, even for labor relations vice presidents who are seasoned veterans. In many cases, the head of labor negotiations is responsible for numerous stakeholder interests, multiple teams and committees, as well as sometimes dozens of bargainers. The other point is, in addition, every round of negotiations is different, as virtually everything changes from one set of bargaining to the next, including the economic environment, the players on both the union side and the management side, demographics of the union membership, and as well bargaining priorities for both the union and management. Accordingly, it's extremely important to set up a robust internal governance process. By that, we want to ensure that all relevant stakeholders have a say in the process and are kept apprised of bargaining progress. You want to make sure there's coordination of the numerous teams, committees, advisors, and support staff. Also want to ensure that there are appropriate lines of communication and checks and balances are in place in terms of contract language, timing, etc. And also, it's important to design and execute an efficient bargaining strategy. The actual size and structure of the bargaining team is largely dependent upon the size of the organization. Clearly, players in small organizations will have multiple roles. They may be on multiple subcommittees or maybe on review committees, etc. So it's really quite dependent on the size of the organization. But for illustration purposes here, we're going to take a look at a typical governance structure in a large manufacturing company. It may change from company to company, but it'll give you an idea for what it may look like. And we'll also look at the roles and responsibilities of the various subcommittees and teams that are in place. This chart is an illustrated example of what a bargaining team would look like. So at the top, you've got your C-suite executives, your CEO, CFO, etc. And then reporting to them would be the labor relations leadership team, who would be headed by presumably the VP of Labor Relations or HR. Then kind of advising that committee would be an internal governance committee, and then reporting up through to the Labor Relations leadership team would be the various subcommittees. For example, in a manufacturing organization, you may have plant operations, health and safety, skilled trades, contract administration, benefits, etc. Then the next committee is kind of a review committee, also labor economics or finance team, and then also you've got the administrative support teams as well. So this is kind of your basic structure. The first team we'll focus on is the Internal Governance Committee. As I noted here, many bargainers dread negotiating with the union, only to discover near the end of the bargaining process that there are tougher negotiations with their own management team. I've seen this a few times. One way to avoid this conflict is to establish a cross-functional internal governance committee early on in the negotiations planning process. The focus here would be to ensure that all key internal stakeholders are well versed on the bargaining objectives, the targets, the strategies, and any contingency plans in the event of a strike or work stoppage. Also, you want to have consensus on a bargaining approach throughout the process in order to avoid surprises in the end. At a minimum, the committee should include senior level representatives from the following areas: labor relations, finance, legal, operations, and also public relations. So we'll spend some time now going through kind of the roles and responsibilities for each of those members of the Internal Governance Committee. The labor relations component, they would have overall responsibility for the internal governance committee. They would set up the committee, they would coordinate the meetings, and the goal here is to obtain consensus on the overall bargaining goals and objectives and get kind of approval from everyone prior to moving on. They would develop the appropriate materials for the committee on bargaining strategy, benchmarking results, and then they would also present the alternative bargaining scenarios with the costing implications to the internal governance committee. And as well, they would keep the internal governance committee and the C-suite executives apprised of the status of negotiations. The finance person would provide guidance on desired financial outcomes and would help establish the target agreement for the contract economics. And in addition, they would provide accounting and finance support as required by the bargainers. The legal representative would ensure company proposals are in compliance with existing labor laws and would also provide support to the bargaining team relative to the development and review of contract language. There may be numerous representatives in the operations side of the house. Could be some people from manufacturing, quality, purchasing. It really depends. Their role would be to identify and articulate any operational or efficiency improvements that the company is seeking. For example, improvements to quality, productivity, absenteeism rates, etc. They would also provide an operational perspective relative to the impact of any specific union demands. For example, improvements to paid time off provisions. How would that affect the operating pattern of the company? Relief time, job classification issues, and so on. Also, they would be in a position to support the bargaining subcommittees as subject matter experts as required. And finally, it's important to have someone from public relations on the team as well. Want to make sure that the PR team is adequately apprised of bargaining cadence, the anticipated union demands, company goals, key issues, status of bargaining, and so on, in order to facilitate timely responses to any media inquiries. And also, they would be responsible for coordinating the overall communication strategy. The review committee is the second major oversight committee that's in the process here. The review committee is comprised primarily of senior labor relations executives who possess cross-functional expertise in multiple labor disciplines, along with internal or external legal staff, depending on the situation. The review committee is typically responsible for the following: planning and execution of the bargaining strategy, including determination of the cadence of the presentation of both contract language and economic offers. They would also review and approve the contract language, and also they would be guiding and mentoring subcommittee chairpersons as required, and they would be the ones negotiating with the highest levels of the union and would have primary responsibility for any economic discussions that took place. And finally, they would have ongoing communication with the Internal Governance Committee. We'll now turn our attention to the bargaining subcommittees. Just from an overview perspective, prior to bargaining, the company and union should discuss and agree upon the establishment of specific bargaining subcommittees. This is typically done well in advance of bargaining, probably months before. Every subcommittee will be responsible for specific relevant topics, and accordingly, union demands are typically assigned to the relevant subcommittees as agreed upon between the company and union. The number of subcommittees really depends on a number of factors, including the size of the organization, the number of bargainers, the nature and complexity of the specific topics. So we'll take a look at some of the sample ones in the manufacturing industry next. The plant operations subcommittee would be responsible for discussions relative to the shop floor aspects of the collective agreement. This would include things such as operating patterns, hours of work, overtime equalization, relief time, absenteeism, standards of conduct, along with discipline and grievance procedures. The health and safety subcommittee is a fairly important one. They would discuss all aspects of health and safety, including guidelines, procedures surrounding hazardous materials, use of personal protection equipment, and basically any health and safety training related issues. The skilled trades subcommittee is also typically a fairly large subcommittee, and they would address all areas of concern related to the skilled trades teams, including tooling allowances, lines of demarcation between skilled trades groups, for example, millwrights performing electrician duties, the use of outside contractors, and things like apprenticeship programs. The Contract Administration Subcommittee would be responsible for all aspects of contract language pertaining to compensation and pay practices. While the high-level economics are typically discussed at the review committee level, this team would typically negotiate the details such as the amounts, timing, and eligibility requirements for the following types of wage-related entitlements: base wage rates, including wage progression periods, overtime pay, shift premiums, any type of team leader premiums, any lump sum payments such as ratification bonuses and negotiated lump sum amounts. They would look at eligibility rules there. Variable compensation such as profit sharing and other gain sharing compensation arrangements, for example, quality awards, attendance awards, etc. They'd also look at paid time off entitlements such as holiday pay, vacation pay, bereavement, jury duty, and military leave pay. They would also address the job and income security provisions such as supplemental unemployment benefit plans. Finally, in this example, the Benefits Subcommittee are typically responsible for negotiating the overall plan designs of the various benefit entitlements. Depending on the size and structure of the company, it may be more practical and efficient to set up separate subcommittees for the various types of benefits. For example, there may be a healthcare subcommittee, pensions and savings subcommittee, and then a separate life insurance and disability subcommittee. It really depends on the structure and nature of your organization. There are numerous contract provisions pertaining to the above noted benefits that need to be considered during bargaining, including things like plan design elements such as types of coverage, eligibility for coverage, the duration of coverage, specific delivery models, and also the whole concept of employee cost sharing. Other considerations that include, are there defined benefit versus defined contribution approaches for things like pensions and retiree health care? What are the vesting periods? And also, is there any retiree coverage? And if so, what does it look like? Now turn our attention to the structure and the roles and responsibilities of the bargaining subcommittees. Typically, the company will appoint a chairperson or lead for each subcommittee. The typical characteristics of the chairperson is basically someone who has adequate knowledge of the subject matter, has previous experience on a subcommittee, and most importantly, has the respect of the union, and the union will listen to that person. In most cases, the subcommittee chair is the senior manager or director who is responsible for that given topic. Subcommittee team members are generally a mix of subject matter experts, along with one or two junior employees that are new to the negotiation process and who are willing and able to take copious notes during subcommittee meetings with the union. This process allows junior members to obtain basically a low-risk exposure to the negotiations process while allowing the more senior team members to focus on discussions with the union. It's extremely important to have pre-meetings prior to any meetings with the union in order to clearly establish the protocol with respect to who is authorized to speak on behalf of the company and who will be taking meeting minutes, etc. In many situations, it's appropriate to only have one speaker in order to ensure that the company message is both consistent and appropriate. Bargaining subcommittees are heavily involved in the bargaining preparation process. Prior to the commencement of negotiations, each subcommittee should be involved in establishing their piece of the overall bargaining strategy. This process should include at least the following. Review of relevant contract language, should conduct both internal and external benchmarking in order to identify opportunities for both improvement and change. They should prepare an assessment for the ideal state and propose migration steps to achieve the aspirational goals of the subcommittee. They should develop specific management proposals and also work with the labor economics or finance teams to cost out the impact of those proposals. They should anticipate union demands and cost out the potential financial impact. Again, working directly with the labor economics and finance teams. And then they should also start by developing data-driven presentations to support their management proposals or refute any anticipated union demands. Most companies establish a bargaining protocol for their bargaining subcommittees. Typically, at the commencement of bargaining, the company receives the official demands from the union, and then these demands are then allocated to the respective subcommittees. The subcommittee chairperson should schedule regular meetings with detailed agendas, of course, with their union counterparts with the following key objectives. They should listen intently to the union demands, clarify the demands in order to fully understand the operational and financial implications of those demands, compare the official demands to the anticipated demands, and communicate any changes to the labor economics or finance teams to update their costing and so on. Also, they should acknowledge and address legitimate demands. For example, health and safety concerns or poor supervisor behavior. It's important for the company to know that and understand it, and it may provide traction in getting the union to listen to the company's concerns. So if you show that you're listening to their concerns intently, they will take your proposals more seriously as well. Also, utilize data-driven presentations to present management proposals or to refute union demands and or manage union expectations as possible. And again, these would all be coordinated with the review committees. And when possible, it's always good to engage in interest-based bargaining versus positional bargaining. As mentioned earlier, there are also support teams. The first one I'm going to talk about is the administrative support team. This group is extremely busy during bargaining. They're tracking open and closed demands from the union, both in total and by subcommittee. They also track the management proposals, and then they also coordinate all of the contract language, including tracking draft and signed language. The labor economics and finance teams are also very important to bargaining. As we'll see later, they are responsible for development of going-in labor costs, developing a going-in cost model, developing a standard costing model that is designed to measure the overall estimated cost of settlement in terms of typically dollars per hour worked and in total dollars as well. They also develop cost estimates related to union demands and any management proposals that are out there. And finally, they develop the overall bargaining strategy from a financial perspective. So they would work with the internal governments committee and so on of trying to, look at the target agreements, and they'll put together alternative scenarios and alternative financial offers for contemplation. And as well, they're responsible for liaison with accountants and actuaries as required. It's also really important that the company establish a daily governance process. And this can take many structures and formats and so on, but at least once or twice daily, the review committee should schedule a roundtable format meeting with all the subcommittee chairpersons. And the purpose of these daily check-ins is just for that. It's a check-in and a guidance ability to provide guidance. Each subcommittee chair should provide a concise review of the overall status of their subcommittee, including, firstly, notable results of the most recent subcommittee meeting, plan for the current day subcommittee meeting, status of any open and closed union demands with an assessment of which outstanding demands are considered high priority for the union, and the status of any management proposals along with the union's reaction to date. This roundtable format provides an excellent opportunity for all the subcommittee chairpersons to hear what challenges or successes their peers are experiencing. It provides an opportunity to perhaps leverage certain items across all subcommittees. It also provides an opportunity for the review committee to provide advice to the subcommittee chairs and also to ensure that messaging is consistent across all subcommittees. In addition, on a regular basis, the review committee should schedule meetings with individual subcommittees to review their proposed language and address any concerns that the team may have. And finally, on a regular basis, the lead negotiator, typically the VP of Labor Relations or head of HR, should have calls with the governance committee, and in some cases, the CEO and CFO to keep them apprised of the progress of negotiations. Next, we're going to look at the cadence of activities for the internal governance process, and we'll go back to the 3 stages of bargaining preparation that we alluded to previously. Stage 1 is, the long-term bargaining preparation, 12 to 18 months prior to bargaining. That's the time frame where we should initially establish the internal governance committee, select the members from operations, from legal, from finance, etc., and make sure that we have a good cross-section of individuals on the committee. We should schedule regular meetings, at least monthly or at a minimum quarterly, so that it doesn't lose any momentum. We should also review the status of long-lead bargaining preparation activities during this time period, such as the bargaining environment assessment. What does the initial assessment look like? Any benchmarking activities that are being performed. How are we doing versus the competition? Start framing up some of those ideas. High-level discussions concerning anticipated union demands and management proposals, and also selection of a review committee and bargaining subcommittee members where possible. Now we move to stage 2 of the process, the midterm bargaining preparation, which is typically 6 to 12 months prior to bargaining. At this point, subcommittees should be reviewing existing contract language and developing management proposals to remove restricted contract language, improve efficiencies, and reduce costs, etc. And the subcommittee should review union demands from prior sets of negotiation, look at grievances that occurred over the past agreement, etc., in order to anticipate any union demands. The subcommittee should also present a summary of any preliminary management proposals, anticipated union demands, and potential alternative bargaining strategies to the oversight committees. So that would be like the review committees and the internal governance committees for review. This process will allow the review and internal governance committees to obtain a big picture view of the preliminary bargaining environment and respective challenges, allowing them to begin to develop an overarching bargaining strategy. Also, in this stage, in this time frame, it's an excellent time to identify negotiations training needs and to deliver desired training modules. They can be facilitated either by in-house subject matter experts or external parties as deemed appropriate. It just depends on the situation. The nature and degree of training will depend largely upon the experience of the bargaining team And the training content may include the following specific modules. This is just a list of ideas. Overview of the bargaining process, including the bargaining timeline, the legal aspects of bargaining, negotiation skills, subcommittee meetings, what are the do's and don'ts, note taking, who should be taking the notes, designated speaker, who has the right to speak, etc. Also, a course in writing contract language, and also just the contract language process. What is the format of the language? What's the review process? Which system is going to be utilized to develop language, etc. And finally, the third and final bargaining preparation, stage 3, is the short-term bargaining preparation stage. This is occurring less than 6 months prior to bargaining. So at this point, subcommittees should be updating their assessment of anticipated union demands, finalizing management proposals, and also developing what we call icebox language for any proposed new or amended contract language. So if you have a number of different scenarios and situations that you think may be proposed over the term, set up different sets of language, just have them on the shelf. That way you're not scrambling later to try to get them done. Subcommittees should continue to meet regularly with the oversight committees in order to ensure that their bargaining strategies are consistent with the overall approach. At this time, the oversight committees, like the review committees and internal governance committees, should be developing an overarching bargaining strategy that begins with the consolidation of the key issues and opportunities from all the subcommittees. This consolidation allows the strategy team to package elements into logical groupings. And then in turn, the strategy team should look for opportunities to juxtapose what the company is willing and or unwilling to do in bargaining against anticipated union demands. This may present quid pro quo scenarios that can be leveraged for win-win solutions. That's really the key here. You're trying to, establish some strategy at this point. So that's just a quick review of a typical internal governance process. The third focus area in bargaining preparation is looking at negotiations, costing models, and strategy formulation. So just a quick overview. Bargaining strategy is typically formulated by taking numerous factors into consideration, including a number of factors. Company goals and objectives, including both financial and non-financial targets, looking at what the union goals and objectives are, conducting a bargaining environment assessment that we talked about earlier, and also looking at competitiveness and conducting some benchmarking on both financial and operational aspects of the business. The labor economics or finance teams are typically actively involved with labor relations leadership in formulating the overall bargaining strategy. So as such, they participate in numerous activities, including competitive benchmarking, conducting a strike analysis by working with the operations folks, development of dynamic costing models for purposes of estimating the costs and or savings associated with things like union demands, management proposals, economics, and even the final economic settlement. So in stage 1 of the long-term bargaining preparation, which is, again, 12 to 18 months prior to bargaining, the labor and economics strategy team should be actively involved in the preliminary bargaining prep. They should be taking the lead in developing the overall bargaining environment assessment that we talked about earlier. They should be coordinating competitive benchmarking efforts, whether it's on labor costs or operating metrics. For example, in the auto industry, as we mentioned before, hours per vehicle for the Harbor Report and problems per 100 in the J.D. Power Report for quality. They should also be coordinating subcommittee deliverables and assisting with any costing requests that are due. For example, anything pertaining to management proposals or anticipated union demands at this stage of the game. In stage 2, the midterm bargaining preparation phase, 6 to 12 months prior to bargaining, we should update the bargaining environment assessment. Is there any impact to the strategy based on those assessments? Also should update the competitive benchmarking analysis, and this is the point where you'd consider hiring a third-party expert to make a presentation to the union. Also should start really refining and developing costing models, bargaining tools, demographic models to get a better lay of the land. Also, we recommend a basic 3-step approach in building a negotiations costing model. These models and tools are presented at a high level in this module, which we'll see coming up, but it really illustrated in more detail in part 2 of this bargaining preparation series. Also, we want to take a look at preparing a strike analysis. That's the economic impact of a strike, plus a strike or lockout preparation manual, another critical document to have in place before you get into bargaining. We're now going to get into the 3-step approach that I mentioned earlier for building a negotiations costing model. The step 1 is to develop an hours worked model. As you can see here, there's an illustrated example Development of the hours worked component of the costing model is really important. It represents the anticipated operating level over the course of the contract and serves as the denominator in the labor cost per hour work calculation, so it's a very critical piece of the pie. A couple of the assumptions required for this component, like the number of employees and overtime hours, are really derived through discussions with the operational teams, including industrial engineers, production forecasters. Sometimes you take a look at history as well. Other assumptions are developed based on contractual entitlements, for example, the number of holidays, vacation entitlement, what is the average for the workforce, coupled with an analysis of the workforce demographics, years of service drive the average vacation entitlements, etc. So this is an important element of the development of the costing model. Step 2 of the process is developing the going-in labor costs on a per hour work basis. These costs represent the all-in cost of labor to the company on a per hour work basis prior to bargaining. They represent the baseline basically for measuring the estimated cost of the new collective agreement. So going in labor costs should be developed utilizing the best available information at the time, like prevailing wage rates, current demographics, the latest pension projections from the actuaries, etc. And all-in labor costs include the following elements: base wages, things like wage premiums such as overtime, shift, team leader premiums, paid time off elements such as holidays, vacations, bereavement, jury duty, military leave, things of that nature. Benefits including health care, pensions, life insurance, disability, supplemental unemployment benefits, and then finally legal costs such as FICA and unemployment comp premiums in the United States, or CPP in employment insurance in Canada, and also workers' compensation costs. So, in a perfect world, should also include retirement-related costs associated with defined benefit plans as well, at least the current service portions. So this particular illustration does not have those in, but those should also be considered. The other thing to look at is the development of a roll-up factor, which we talk about here, but it's really, we'll get into it in more detail in part 2 of this bargaining preparation series. And another element to consider is an inactive factor, because certain elements, there are people that are off work on disability and so on that may be eligible for certain benefits and so on, so those should be factored in as well. In step 3 of the process for developing a negotiations costing model is illustrated in this chart. It really utilizes inputs from the previous 2 steps, namely the annual hours worked and as well the going-in costs are part of this model. One thing to note is the continuation costs. So they represent the incremental costs the company will incur regardless of the level of new economics of the contract. So examples of continuation costs would be something like healthcare inflation, cost increases associated with changes in employee demographics, such as incremental vacation entitlements as employees gain seniority, other known increases that are available out there, maybe increases in company legals and things of that nature. And it's important to track these costs separately from new economics in order to more accurately, portray the cost of the agreement as opposed to the cost of the old agreement continuing on. The intent of this model is to measure the incremental labor costs of both the dollars per hour work basis as well as in terms of millions of dollars over the 3-year contract duration in this example. So that's the intent here. Again, this 3-step approach will be reviewed in much more detail in part 2 to the bargaining preparation series. In stage 2, it's also important to start developing bargaining tools. These bargaining tools are excellent to improve costing efficiencies and assist in the formulation of overall bargaining strategy. For example, start pulling together building blocks where you're starting to use your costings model to, what would the cost of a 1% wage increase be? What is the cost of a $1,000 lump sum? What is the cost of increasing pension contribution rates by 1%, etc.? So having all those rules of thumb at your fingertips will really help you in formulating business strategy down the road. And the other thing that's very helpful is there's an illustration of it here on this page, is the development of a demographic analysis in the form of an agent service grid. This is an excellent tool to give you an idea of where the employees are located in terms of both years and service, so you can see, who do you have to appeal to the most to get a ratified collective agreement. Are you heavy on the older employees? Are you heavier on the younger employees with low service? It'll give you an idea of who you need to appeal to, and it helps formulate your strategy that way as well. Another important task in stage 2 of the bargaining preparation process is conducting a strike analysis. The company should prepare a strike analysis to calculate the potential cost of a strike, whether it's 1 day, 1 week, 1 month. The cost-benefit analysis assists in making strike or no strike or potential lockout decisions at the strike deadline, rather than running around at the end trying to calculate what it's going to cost you. The strike analysis should take both economic and non-economic factors into consideration, and typical questions that should be addressed in the strike analysis may include things like the following. Can lost revenue be made up? If so, at what cost? Do you have to work overtime to get it? Can you just book more Saturdays or Sundays? Is there even a possibility of making up the lost units? Can the company build a sufficient strike bank between now and the expiration of the contract? And a strike bank is essentially a buildup of finished product that can be sold or utilized in the event of a strike. Other questions. What is the impact on suppliers and customers? Are there any cost penalties associated with non-performance? And also, will a strike or lockout impact the company's reputation? So these are all things that should be considered when preparing a strike analysis. In addition, the company should also develop a comprehensive strike or lockout manual that outlines the protocol in the event that a strike or lockout occurs. The bargaining team should work closely with the corporate security to ensure that procedures are put into place to protect the safety of all potential stakeholders, including union and management employees, suppliers, customers, and visitors to the premises. The manual should clearly outline the process for entering the company facility, including where to park, how and when to cross the picket lines, etc. It should also address potentially contentious issues such as utilization of replacement workers or management employees to complete striking union member tasks. That's another issue that should be looked at. Finally, the bargaining team should work closely with the company's public relations team in order to prepare a communication strategy outlining how and when employees will be updated and notified of the status of operations. In many cases, employees are directed to listen to the local radio station for status updates. Finally, in stage 3 of the bargaining preparation process, or the short-term bargaining preparation stage, this is less than 6 months prior to bargaining. The following things should be done. Should update the bargaining environment assessment again and make any updates to your business strategy or negotiation strategies as may be deemed necessary. Should update competitive benchmarking analysis and lock in data for purposes of developing presentations to be shared with the union. Should finalize their costing models and develop alternative offer scenarios for senior management to contemplate. Also, in working with finance, should obtain a target agreement from senior leadership, and this may include both economic and non-economic items. And also need to develop a proposed cadence of detailed offers, recognizing, of course, that these draft offers will likely change as bargaining moves forward. It's always good to have a plan. And we typically call this a playbook. It's a number of offers, successive offers that may be played out. Again, you have to be flexible. So also utilize bargaining strategy formulation tools to assist with this process. And many of these things are addressed in more detail in part 2 of the bargaining preparation series. Finally, the fourth and final focus area of this bargaining preparation module is on communication strategy. In general, it's becoming more and more important for employers to create a comprehensive communication strategy for many reasons. Union communication efforts are becoming more effective and more advanced. They're effectively using social media such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube to get their points out to their members. They're now hiring PR consulting firms on a regular basis. Union communication is typically more aggressive and responsive than management communication. And also unions are often deliver more emotion-based rather than fact-based messaging. For example, CEO pay versus unionized employee pay. It is very emotional. And also union activist groups, people who aren't even voting on the contract, are becoming more involved, and they're messaging directly to employees. Often you'll see pamphlets on the shop floors now. Therefore, it's really important that the company establish a comprehensive communication strategy and should consider the following things. Should consider all possible outcomes and develop contingency plans accordingly. For example, tentative agreement, an extension agreement, ratification or non-ratification of the agreement, a strike, lockout. For each one of these scenarios, there should be comprehensive plans in place to take care of each one of them. And also, we should develop strong media and influencer relationships and consider conducting media backgrounders. Media backgrounders are an excellent strategy in situations where union negotiations are expected to be a very public matter. In essence, they represent frank, off-the-record conversations with select media and or industry influencers that allow the company to present their side of the story with respect to bargaining topics. The most common messaging is related to competitiveness issues such as wages and benefits or productivity and quality, things of that nature. Typically, the media are not allowed to utilize any of the information discussed during the meetings unless expressly approved by the company. We all know that unions typically do an excellent job of telling their side of the story, so if their members haven't received a wage increase in years, then everyone will know that. In situations like this, and if there is still a competitiveness issue and these employees are paid well above market, it gives the companies an opportunity to kind of push back by going through the media and saying, hey, did you know that although they haven't had a raise in 5 years, they are already making 20% over the market rates. So it's just an opportunity that perhaps the media will write both sides of the story in their articles, or perhaps push back on the union when interviewing them. It's also very important to monitor both internal and external chatter, and it's important that the company appoints someone to listen and document these types of things, someone from other public relations department if possible. And it's also very important to prepare and train company spokespeople and frontline supervisors to ensure that everyone's giving a consistent message during bargaining. Companies should develop a strategy and also messages for negotiations. So consider being proactive, but take the high road. You always have to avoid negotiating through the media. It's important to educate employees. The goal is to help manage expectations and inform them. Town halls are an excellent opportunity to communicate data with respect to things like productivity, quality, safety, attendance, just anything relating to competitiveness. Social media is available, posting boards in the plant, company website perhaps dedicated to negotiations, and even direct mailings are effective at times. Some of the things that I've seen are direct mailings to employees that show their healthcare spend versus the average healthcare spend of an employee at the company. So that, again, focus on key topics, business updates, competitiveness, labor costs, healthcare spending, things of that nature. And messaging is extremely important. It should be simple, factual, backed with data where possible, consistent. It should be repeated and also planned. For example, what is the topic of the month leading up to bargaining? Maybe one month it's productivity, next month it's quality, next month it's wage-related costs or things of that nature. So in terms of timing, Stage 1 bargaining preparation, long-term bargaining preparation, 12 to 18 months prior to bargaining, it's time to begin developing the company's overall communication strategy. So consider alternative communication forums. It's never too early to begin communicating. Town halls, as mentioned earlier, excellent opportunity to communicate business updates and status relative to operational metrics such as productivity, quality, attendance, labor costs, things of that nature. Fact sheets are good. They can be posted or displayed in the workplace. Things like, did you know this, did you know that? Direct mailings to employees, again, as mentioned earlier. For example, employees' healthcare spending for the year versus a company average. A great way to get a message out there. You should be setting up the company website, inserting some quick facts, some Q&A, who the bargaining team is, and potentially scheduled updates during bargaining or whatever the protocol is going to be during bargaining. And then finally, it's a good time to set up social media accounts. In Stage 2 of bargaining preparation, that's the midterm bargaining preparations phase, 6 to 12 months prior to bargaining. Companies should consider whether or not the company's intended messages are being communicated effectively so far. We should be constantly listening and trying to refine things as we go. So if not, what changes should be made with respect to messaging content, the cadence, delivery mechanisms, etc.? We should be continuing our internal and external listening. We should be monitoring social media, newspaper, talking to supervisors on the floor, finding out what employees are saying, things of that nature. Also, if you're considering conducting media backgrounders, you should begin to develop presentations with the appropriate messaging and managing of expectations that would go with that. And finally, we should start developing content for the company website. And finally, in Stage 3 of the bargaining preparation stages, short-term bargaining preparation, less than 6 months prior to bargaining. Again, we should consider whether or not the company's intended messages are being communicated effectively so far. And again, if not, what changes should be made, what modifications should be made with respect to messaging content, cadence, delivery mechanisms, etc. Continue the internal and external listening, monitor social media, newspapers, etc. This should really assist in anticipating union demands because we're getting close to bargaining now, so the real demands should start coming through. Media backgrounders, if applicable, should be finalizing presentations and delivered to media and key influencers. And we should be finalizing content and launch the company websites and social media channels at this point. Should also conduct your media training for appointed spokespeople, whether they're the VP of Labor Relations or HR, and also providing some training to supervisors just so that they know, what they can and cannot say to employees during the bargaining process. And finally, we should finalize the communication protocol for all possible bargaining outcomes, as noted before. So in summary, for this part one of bargaining preparation and strategy formulation series, some of the key points to take away today are as follows. It's never too early to begin bargaining preparations. We talk about 12 to 18 months in advance. It can be any time. In fact, some people will argue that we should constantly be preparing for the next set of bargaining. We should be developing a robust internal governance process with the appropriate checks and balances. We need to develop dynamic negotiations costing models and consider numerous alternative scenarios. Utilize bargaining tools to develop overall bargaining strategy. Recognize that the process must be fluid as nothing ever goes as planned, but it's always good to have those tools and playbooks on the shelf. Ensure that you have a comprehensive communication strategy and plan for all possible bargaining outcomes. And finally, work closely with your experts, your legal, accounting, actuarial, in order to satisfy any compliance concerns. It's really important that they're on board. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is part one of the bargaining preparation strategy formulation series. Part two gets into much more detail with respect to negotiation, costing models, and strategy formulation. I would encourage you to take part in that series as well. Thank you for taking the time to participate in our on-demand webinar today. I am pleased to inform you that HR and Labor Guru has 3 distinct on-demand webinar series with a total of 7 modules as follows. First, we have the Reduce Your Labor Cost series, and there are 2 modules in this series. Secondly, we have the Bargaining Preparation series, and again, there are 2 modules in this series. And finally, we have the HR Analytics series, and there are 3 modules in this particular series. I would like to take a few minutes to talk to you about the content in the respective series. In a few instances, certain strategic concepts are introduced at a high level in one module, and then for those of you who are interested, presented in a deeper dive format in another module. I will attempt to highlight these situations as I quickly walk you through the module highlights. First, let's talk about the Reduce Your Labor Costs series. These modules will appeal to anyone interested in reducing their labor costs, whether you're an HR or labor professional looking to redesign your compensation and benefit plans, preparing for negotiations with the union, or simply a corporate controller looking for opportunities to reduce labor costs. Part 1 of the Reduce Your Labor Costs series deals with compensation and workforce composition. In this series, you'll develop an in-depth understanding of the numerous financial elements that should be considered when calculating all-in labor costs. Also, you get an understanding of several internal and external factors to take into consideration when contemplating modifications to compensation. Also, compare and contrast employee or union versus company preferences with respect to compensation alternatives, to recognize strategic opportunities to offer lump sums and or variable compensation versus fixed wage increases. And finally, in this module, you'll obtain a clear understanding of how changes to a company's workforce composition can be one of the most union-friendly opportunities to significantly reduce and or mitigate rising all-in labor costs over time. In contrast, Part 2 of the Reduce Your Labor Costs series deals primarily with healthcare, pensions, and other employee benefits. In this module, you'll gain an appreciation for the importance of plan design decisions in driving overall employee healthcare costs. You look at things like employee cost share, delivery models, and clinical programs. Also, you look at the identification of the multiple levers, strategies, and tools available to mitigate rising healthcare costs. Also, we'll take a look at a 3-step analytical approach to identify key focus areas in order to facilitate potential cost reduction strategies for healthcare. And also, we'll have a comprehensive strategy to address high-cost healthcare elements using a reduce model. And we'll also take a look at developing win-win healthcare solutions for both employers and employees or their unions. In addition, you'll understand cost mitigation strategies for other employee benefits, including pensions, disability, life insurance, paid time off, and retiree benefits. And finally, learn about proven strategies aimed at reducing other post-employment benefit obligations and costs related to retiree benefits. Secondly, let's talk about the bargaining preparation and strategy formulation series. These modules will appeal to anyone looking for practical guidance relative to preparing for bargaining with the union, whether you're a member of the actual negotiations team or a member of one of the support teams, such as finance or public relations. Most of the content, particularly with respect to strategy formulation, will appeal to all levels of an organization, including directors and vice presidents. Part 1 of this series is called Bargaining Preparation. This module outlines the key negotiations preparation activities that should be performed from 12 to 18 months in advance of bargaining right through to opening day. The key areas of focus for bargainers typically include the following: a bargaining environment assessment, development of a robust internal governance process, development of negotiations costing models, formulation of bargaining strategy, and finally, creation of a comprehensive communication strategy. And all of these elements are dealt with in this module. While negotiations, costing models, and strategy formulation are presented at a high level in Part 1, for those of you interested in more of a deep dive, I would highly recommend looking at Part 2 in this series as well. Part 2 is called Negotiations, Costing Models, and Strategy Formulation. In this module, you'll develop an in-depth understanding of the numerous financial elements that should be considered when calculating all-in labor costs and creating negotiations costing models. You'll also obtain a clear understanding of how to develop a dynamic cost model by utilizing a simple 3-step approach. In addition, you'll learn how to develop practical bargaining tools that can be utilized to improve efficiencies when costing out union demands and management proposals, develop alternative economic offers, and assist in formulating overall bargaining strategy. As well, you'll learn how to develop a simple matrix that will assist the company in identifying potential win-win solutions with the union. And finally, you'll understand the importance of developing a comprehensive economic offer playbook by consolidating input from the various subcommittees. And finally, let's talk about the HR Analytics series. These modules will appeal to a wide variety of professionals, including those in the analytics, finance, HR, and labor relations fields. Part 1 of this series is entitled Building a Value-Added HR Analytics Function. In this module, you'll take a look at the structure, roles, and responsibilities of an effective HR analytics team. We'll also talk about how to address common challenges that companies face in growing their HR analytics function. We'll identify quick wins and value-added projects that will appeal to both HR business partners and HR centers of excellence. And finally, we'll take a look at an introduction to predictive analytics through an illustration of a 6-step process. Part 2 of the HR Analytics series is called Breaking the HR Analytics Paradigm. We're going to be looking at hourly workforce data. First thing we're going to look at is recognizing the low-hanging fruit associated with the examination of hourly workforce data. We're going to focus on operational and cost savings opportunities associated with 3 distinct areas. First, absenteeism, including Family Medical Leave Act in the United States. Secondly, the hourly hiring process. And thirdly, hourly employee payroll data. And the final module in this series is Part 3 that deals with healthcare analytics. We're going to gain an appreciation for the importance of plan design decisions in driving overall employer healthcare costs. Look at things such as employee cost share, delivery models, and clinical programs. In addition, we're going to look at the identification of multiple levers, strategies, and tools available to mitigate rising healthcare costs, and also have to do an in-depth understanding of a 3-step analytical approach to identify key focus areas in order to facilitate potential cost reduction strategies. And we'll also look at a comprehensive strategy to address high-cost elements utilizing the reduce model. And the idea here is to develop win-win solutions for both employers and employees and their unions. Thank you for your time. I hope that these webinars provide you with valuable guidance and practical solutions in addressing the many HR and labor challenges facing your organization.